Good morning, everyone. As a climate justice activist, I'm going to speak about the gendered impacts of climate change. And basically, I'll be talking it from the views of those who are mostly impacted, who are the rural communities, women, the youth, the elderly, that we work with in most of the times. So basically what I'm going to do is I'll also be showing a video, because we believe as Gender CC, when we do our work, that we don't usually like to speak on behalf of people, but those who are impacted to be able to speak for themselves in terms of how they are being impacted by climate change. And that is exactly the way I'm going to be doing this presentation. But however, before I start this presentation, I just want to send through a trigger warning on the first video that I'm going to show, that is going to speak about certain uncomfortable issues. If there are those who find it uncomfortable, I would really ask you to forgive me, and to maybe, if you want, you can step back out of the room for a while and then come back when you think it's right to do so. But these are women speaking their own views, and I hope you can forgive all of us for that. This is what we see in the field on a daily basis, and these are the women we work with. And as my preamble to my presentation, I think I'll take in from what Professor Osome was just saying exactly. We all here this whole week, I think we've just discovered we've been richly imbued with this reproductive issues, and these are critical issues, and they are coming out at this very critical time. And I think we are taking in from the theoretical aspects and trying to move that to the more practical issues that we see on the ground. And as Gender CC, whilst we work with communities, they find some of these international processes where we find ourselves in quite alienating for themselves to be there, to be part of. But the things that they want, they are not different from what all of us as feminists who are gathered here really want. And I'll just give that little brief before I move on into the video. They all know that this is a critical time for them, and the world is battling multiple crises. That is the climate change crisis, an economic crisis, and the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, as you rightly said, and we've been hearing that throughout the whole week. Although the changing climate has affected us all, they know that them as women, especially the ones that we work with, the women and girls, and particularly those who are marginalized by various systems, they bear the greater burdens from the impacts of climate change. And sometimes the state does not even reach out, or even us as civil society reach out to those people in order to address their issues. Despite multiple challenges and structural barriers, there has been exceptional work that has been done by different communities of protecting the national environment. It doesn't mean that whilst they are being impacted, they are sitting around and doing nothing about it. They are also beginning to do certain things in order to build their own community resilience, of which sometimes they are supported and sometimes there is no support at all. For decades, feminists have advocated for major emitters to take greater responsibility in climate response actions, as well as their own equal representation in climate negotiations and decision-making spaces from local to global, which is where a lot of the women and the youth and the marginalized communities that we work with, they find themselves mostly quite alienated from that process. Women and youth have been making specific demands across 6 priority areas, and I'll just list them so that at least when I get into the video and everything else, we are all on the same page, that whilst as feminists we are demanding those issues, the people on the ground, whilst they might not give the same terms to them, these are the same issues that they would also want to see, because we are fighting the same battle here, but they might term it differently. The inclusion of women and people in national and the unified decision process, for them, what they really want is a just and equitable transition from fossil fuels for all. This is what a lot of these women and communities are asking, because they've suffered a lot. And they believe that the provision of adequate, accessible, affordable, and flexible, and human rights-centered finance as a matter of justice and equity is quite critical for them, in order for them to move them to where they want and to be able to continue to build the resilience that they want. They would also prefer, from what we're talking about, to ensure that agricultural and land rights are centered around this whole transition, and sustainable community-owned and women-led technological solutions, because they feel that when you leave them out, these solutions are not representative of their needs. And lastly, the intersectionality and coherence with broader frameworks for sustainable development, the idea that social identities such as race, class, gender, religion, for them are fundamentally interconnecting. And you can hear it when they talk. They say, us as black women, we are not allowed to enter into these spaces. Us as poor women, us as elderly women, you can see those interconnections when women and youth speak, in terms of how much they are being marginalized by the system that we are living in, and therefore one another to create systems of advantage and disadvantage. So when they look at this system, the capitalist system that we are talking about, they see themselves as the ones that are disadvantaged and discriminated, and therefore issues of gender are actually compounded with issues of race and class. So feminists have now been arguing for years, and we have been here, all of you have been doing that climate change is a grave and mounting threat to our collective well-being and a healthy planet. Human-induced climate change is causing dangerous and widespread disruption in nature and affecting the lives of billions of people. And therefore, they would want to see this change in order to be able to do the reproductive issues that they would want, to be able to put food, water, and energy on the tables for their children. Their children need to go to school, to have well-being, to have decent work. These are the things that communities are actually calling for. And those who were at COP27 can agree with me that these were some of the demands that the African feminists were calling for, even at COP27. I'll therefore put on this video so that you can just see one of the women putting it across in the way that they would want, and we can probably have a discussion on it. I went to a school in Giani, in Tsanini, at Risenga Primary School. And the first instance that hit me hard as someone working in the NGO world was that when we arrived, it's a very dry area, Giani, north of the Limpopo, very hot. I slept when I arrived in the evening, and the following day when I woke up, I went to that school. But first of all, I passed through the chief in order to present myself that I've just come to your area. And the chief said, "Oh, thank you so much. You've brought us good tidings. We've never had rains or water in the past 3 years. Therefore, this is how they welcomed me. We're going to call you the Rain Queen." And I graciously accepted. That was an honor. But then when the chiefs, but there were only few droppings of water that came, like little drops, and then it stopped. But because all the water that we're getting, even for ourselves, we're buying it from those people with boreholes, and we're paying for about 5 rand for a 20-liter of water. And those are the lives and the realities of the women that I work with. And then when I went to the school where I was proceeding to, as a site, as part of our work as Gender CC, I was also hit by the same thing which is almost being discussed in this video. The first thing that I saw the boys were out, they were playing football. And the girls were nowhere to be found. And my first question was, where are the girls in the school? I thought it's for both boys and girls. And then I was told the girls have just walked 5 kilometers away to look for water. That is how I started my journey to say, how can we be the change that we want to see? And I started by saying, why is it that the girls went to look for water 5 kilometers away? Do you realize the kind of harm that you are putting them through? And then that's when we started a whole discussion, seated under a tree, and then things started to come together. And all my discussions that has shaped the work that we have done at Gender CC happens when we are seated, not in places like these ones, but when we are seated and gathered around under the tree with communities that we work with. And they realize that there is no reason for the girls to continue to live those kinds of lives that they are living, and the boys are playing football. I think all of them realize that after a number of discussions and telling their stories, and even how the girls sometimes get attacked 5 kilometers away, that there was need to make a drastic change to the way we live, and it has to start at their household. Thank you. Our focus should not be on women as victims of climate change, rather on how they can be leaders, designers and implementers of solutions, and how we can all take action that enable them to fulfill those roles. And I think we saw that in the video, where they're taking charge of their lives and trying to change their lives for the better. And as we look at the gender climate nexus, which is well documented by researchers, the policy priorities, strategies, investments need to be much more widely implemented by governments, corporates, and citizens. And most of those strategies that are being put into action, into implementation plans, into the national adaptation policies, they are being put there, but what is lacking is their implementation. And there are people who are ready to, who are willing, who would want to see those policies actually being put into practice so that their lives can change at the village level, at the local level, at the country level, at the regional level, and at the international level, and also to change our whole lives here, all of us. I think we would want to see that change happen. So climate change that lacks a gendered lens, to wipe this lens clearly, risks maintaining the disproportionate impact of climate change on women and creating new inequalities. And that is the reason why I brought this argument on. When you look at some of these impacts that we see, we've seen that about 80% of those people, even when there are floods or droughts or any kind of hurricanes that happen, like cyclones, like these days Southern Africa is facing those hurricanes, those cyclones, and the floods, especially the ones that happened in Durban. A lot of people are displaced by climate change, and estimated to be women, and women are 14 times more likely to die during environmental disasters. This disproportionate impact is driven by factors such as women's role as carers for others, because sometimes they don't want even to run away because they are either looking for a granny or they are looking after the children. Their lack of access to warning systems and lack of resources and independence. I remember when Cyclone Idai was coming, the first thing I did was to tell my mother, who is a farmer, Mama, Cyclone Idai is coming and she's in the Eastern Highlands. Can you please leave your place? Leave it now. And my mother did not leave I like to tell these stories of reality. Now it comes even closer to home, from work even to my own life. I told my mother, leave where you are staying. And then the first thing she says, but what will happen to my chickens? Mtanami, mwanangu. But where would we go? Although the early warning system was there, it was given, but all she was thinking now was about her livelihood. What will happen? And I said, but you're thinking of your livelihood. What if you won't even survive? The lack of resources to rebuild their lives after climate-related events hit and are excluded from taking mitigation actions to lower the impact in the first place. This puts strains on food production, drought and impacts, and also the availability of water, inadequate fuel, and which impact women disproportionately. And these are the realities that happen. And the severity is going to become even worse with time. And we need to change. We need to act now. I'm now speaking as an activist. This is not something that we say we want to do maybe later or sometime, but this is something that is happening. These are the realities. And the gender gap isn't limited to rural areas of the world. As the flight to the city increases, most people now, like I was telling my mother, to run away from the rural area to the city. But 2.5 billion extra people are expected to live in urban centers by 2050. So the negative impact of climate events are magnified due to higher population densities. And we're talking about even the struggle for land within the urban areas as well, because when they move to those cities, the first thing that will come in is, where am I going to have food in order to sustain themselves? And those are the realities we are facing with the gendered impacts of climate change. Women, as we have talked, they are mostly the ones, and the video has shown us that they are mostly the ones who are universally in charge of cooking, heating, and lighting the home, and are critical pivot for scaled adoption of solar and other green domestic energy solutions. The millions of women in the agricultural sector too are key to the scaling up of sustainable agricultural practices and the resilience of the global food supply. Recently, we have been talking about saying, how can we change the food system so that it can actually address the needs of the women? And that is why we've been moving on. Even in urban areas, we're claiming little spaces of land to begin to form urban agricultural projects, because people are looking at those realities that are affecting them on a daily basis. A wide range of sustainable agricultural methods actually offers women opportunities in terms of how they can be able to provide food for their own children and their own sustenance as well. And if women, it has been found by research, and those who are doing research, we've got so many of researchers here, some of it done by UN Women. If women had the same access to resources as men on farm yields would increase by 20 to 30%, because climate change is actually affecting the agricultural yields. But if they would have that access, then at least there would be an increase in terms of those agricultural yields, together with different ways of producing those different kinds of agricultural processes. So women's economic empowerment has many significant benefits. Women as consumers make greener and more sustainable buying choices. You can challenge me on that one. They spend more on their children's education. You can challenge me on that one if you want. And health, benefiting the wider community. This investment in education and family health has a compounding positive effect for the whole societies. And that's a reality that we have seen. And I'm not just bragging about it. I've seen it in the communities where we work. When you change the lives of women, you start seeing them actually changing the whole lives within their own families, even though it's difficult. Sometimes there's a backlash. Sometimes when the women become more powerful in those communities, they're actually either beaten up by their husbands, bringing in another level of violence, because society is not ready to accept an empowered and powerful woman. And those are the realities we deal with the communities. You hear that, oh, I was beaten up last night. And then what was the challenge? The problem was I had made about 6,000 or 7,000 rands over the produce that I had made from the garden. And he wanted that money so that he can go and have a beer. I'm saying this in a very crude manner. These are the stories that we hear on a daily basis. And I'm not saying all men are like that and all individuals are like that, but those are the realities. I'm sorry about the little things that I hear. The gendered impacts of climate change, they continue again. Again, the empowerment of women can drive the creation of new models for our economies and societies. Right now, we are looking at how can we change this system. And progressive business models exemplified by the circular economy, I'm sure you've heard about it, the work done by, for example, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation are already showing what can be achieved. Solar Sisters, those who know Solar Sisters in their country, they are training women in Nigeria and Tanzania to sell affordable renewable energy appliances. All these initiatives and thousands like them are helmed by women. So they are creating the change. They are not victims. They are leading the change that they would want to see. The empowerment of women and their inclusion in the implementation of climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies is critical in creating the world that we want to see. I would give you an overview of the global and the national context in terms of when we are looking at women at work, because those are some of the issues we're talking about. And these are the statistics that came from Statistics South Africa, because I'll start with the global context. Across the globe, women who are looking for work and are available to work find it more difficult to find employment than men. And that's a reality that has been produced by research. Compared to the rest of the world, South Africa exhibits a higher rate of unemployment for the general population. And you can see that even on the Statistics South Africa website and everything. There were 47.0% of South African women who were economically inactive in 2022. And those women needed something to eat. And as NGOs and as government, as whatever, people were trying to give them food parcels. But will they is that assisting the situation, or is to assist them just so that they continue to feed a system that is not working? Some of the solutions that we bring about, there was someone who raised it and said, even the NGOs themselves, even the state themselves, most of the solutions that we bring about, they are not going to bring about structural change. And I'm going to admit it right here, someone who works in the NGO world. Some of our solutions, most of our solutions do not bring the structural change that we are looking for. They sometimes even assist the capitalist system to continue to thrive. And there are sectors that are most impacted by climate change. And these sectors are mostly, you can see them because we do have, when there are warmer temperatures, sea level rise, extreme weathers, agriculture, forestry, we're talking about forestry, fishery, and tourism. This is where we find even the women actually working in those areas. And these are sectors that are highly, highly affected and very impacted by climate change. Agriculture, most of the food we eat, most of the agriculture is being done largely by women. Women and gender in South African agriculture in 2019, the Sustainability Initiative found out that an average of 20% of farmers who owned farms were women. Most full-time employees were men, 60%, while 52% part-time or seasoned employees were women. So basically, women just work on pieces of land of which they do not have, they don't even own. And this brings us to say, if we want to change this, we have to look at all these things of land tenure rights and all these differences. And most of the women, the communities that we work with, they reject GMO. even when we go to them, we are actually working with them. They've formed seed banks of their own indigenous seeds, seed varieties that they are actually beginning to share amongst themselves, and that is what we are pushing through. And those are seeds of the different varieties that are climate resistant and that were used before, that we'd forgotten about, and where our mothers and grandmothers used to use and package, and they are beginning to use that. So as we don't go into any shop and just buy any of those seedlings for the communities that we work with.
I just have a follow-up question. Would I be correct in saying that organizations such as the World Food Program and other United Nations,
Gates Foundation,
and all those organizations, are they perpetuating bad seeds in Africa, because they donate this food to Africans for them to eat and to farm, but having the opposite thing in terms of packaging and food production?
Absolutely. Africa is a dumping ground when you look at it, because they bring in easy fixes to us, and if we are not careful, and that is the system that we are living in, they want to bring in all easy fixes to Africa. And I think it's high time we should begin to say no to certain things. Enough is enough to certain things, and begin to go back to basics, to the way that we used to live. Not that we are forgetting about the science. Let's merge the science together, but with our indigenous knowledge, and then move on forward from there. The problem is for having people giving us a top-down approach to how we should continue to live, and dumping GMOs onto our people. And right now there's a whole feminist movement building which is going on, which is rejecting the use of GMOs. And also we find also a fishery becomes another sector where we find women there, and especially small-scale fisher folk, through the mobilization, lobbying and advocating for legal recognition and sustainable livelihoods. And I think I'll put all these references, they are also in my presentation, and I'm hoping that it will be shared with you. And the promotion of equity, gender mainstreaming, self-reliance, and sustainable within the small-scale fisher sector must be a central focus. And you'll see that also within the reading list that I've actually put on this presentation. It's all there. You can actually read it for yourself, and you can begin to see how we can begin to change things. Tourism, it's another sector where we find ourselves, our women, and during the pandemic and things like that, there was a lot of loss of jobs. And how are we going to revive that whole sector and make it meet the needs of women in a sustainable manner? So community support for women leadership at all levels, public, private, is required here in order to contribute to tourism to be recognized, duly recorded by considering unpaid work and monitoring tourism activities carried out in household and communities. That work needs to be monitored, and it needs to be given a cost. There's a lot of paid and unpaid work that happens, even in the tourism sector, at the household sector. And I think that brings us to the things that we are talking about here, in terms of social reproduction, and in terms of how that whole productivity is being fed by a different group of people who are not even participating in the whole system itself. And those systems continue to operate side by side. And yet the other one is actually feeding the capitalist society. And those are the changes that we would want to see. What can be done to assist women? Land tenure, access to land. In most cases, with the local communities, we've worked with some women who want to start food gardens, but they often do not have access to land. And we're talking about the issue of access to land. There are projects, and now some are approaching schools for space. Most of our projects where we work in, we actually approach schools, hospitals, to say, can we use your space so that at least they can plant. And most of the food that is planted through agroecological systems is actually used to support the food systems within the schools. The first food that comes off there actually goes to feed the children, and that is the work that we are actually involved in. And in most areas that we are working in, we move on to say that food should ensure that we center nutrition here, nutritional food. That has to be given, whether we plant at a hospital site or at the school in order to support the school feeding scheme. The children themselves, they also have to be involved so that they begin to learn, and we catch them at a younger age so that they begin to realize that nutrition is quite important for them, and they understand how food is grown, how nutritious food is grown, and they become part of this process. So we've decided that although we've lost some of us to the KFCs and the whatevers, I'm not saying I've got anything against eating KFC and all the junk food we eat sometimes, but we're trying to catch them young to begin to say nutritious food is good for you and is good for the climate as well. Thank you. And also additional training comes in. Most access to finance is the one big thing that the women have been talking about, even at the international UNFCCC level. Women are always saying, we need climate finance, we need climate finance. But that finance does not trickle down properly to those people that are actually needed. Somehow there are blockages on the way, although we talk about it all the time, even at the international level, even at the country level. We find that those who are in need actually get trickles, and that's a problem. Because I think if we want to change this system, we have to start from that level, from the households level, from the village. I'm taking you back to the village in order to begin to create the change that we would want to see on a bigger scale. There's a hand there. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask, a few weeks ago I went to a talk that was looking at HIV testing and the use of PrEP for pregnant women. And this is linking to what you were saying about gender-based violence when women are empowered. And sometimes that leads to increases in gender-based violence. So in this talk, it was like an intervention thing. It was public health, I'm not so sure about the ethics of it. But one element of it was including men into the program to also help, there was training of how women can facilitate conversations with men for couples to get tested together. And then also incorporating men into the program so that women wouldn't have to hide the use of PrEP or that kind of stuff. And I was wondering, in your field, has there been interventions or NGO approaches or something that kind of involves men in these processes to try and mitigate these facts? Is it problematic? I don't know.
Can I answer that question? Thank you so much. I'll start from the beginning. We faced so much backlash. The fact that we enter into a community and we first of all introduce ourselves. I will start by giving you a story of what happened to us and then address your question. When we entered into one of the areas that we were working with, the first thing that we said, we are Gender CC. And there were 300 people in a hall. We are Gender CC, Women for Climate Justice. And then we were telling them about our work and what we would want to do in that area and everything that we're going to do, and would want to work with communities in order to change things, in order to make sure that they understand what is going on within the whole climate change discourse, and also bringing in the gender and climate change discourse. And the first thing that the men did when we put them all together was a number of chairs. We listened. There were a lot of chairs that were being moved. Suddenly, a lot of men, young men, and others who didn't think, they started saying, oh, this is not for us. We are leaving. This discussion is not for us. It's for the women, and they were leaving. So we changed course. Then we started to say, how can we then enter into communities and not to alienate the men from the women? And then that's when we created those safe spaces for women and men, and then bring them together after the discussion, because we're losing a lot of the men on the way. They were not buying into this discussion of empowering women. They were saying, I'm not having. But when they started seeing the benefits of their empowered women, they started now to be the advocates and the proponents now of women's empowerment. But that takes a lot of time. And especially in much more traditional societies where we work with, sometimes I'm working in Vembe, in whatever, those are very difficult areas, even to bring issues of HIV testing to men. And I think research has also shown that a lot of men don't even want to be tested, right? They would want to know that if you are tested, then it means I'm also okay. You have heard those stories, right? They look at you and say, oh, so if you are negative, I must be negative too, isn't it? Yes. So those conversations are very difficult, especially in most of the most traditional societies that we work with. I'm not sure if other people who work on HIV, they can share some of their experiences here. You can do that, and how you've entered into that terrain also, so that we can help this discussion. Thank you. There's the issue of climate and public debt, the link between climate change and public debt. I think, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this correctly. I think there is a link, because I think if you're talking about public debt, maybe the economists here, they will assist me. A lot of the debt that our governments or whoever are getting, they are trying to solve the climate crisis, right? But then they end up with a lot of debt in order to try and alleviate poverty and things like that, but it doesn't happen like that. And most of the times, we've seen those links actually going on, and corruption also being part of this as well. And so I think there's a link there between climate change and this ballooning the public debt, which continues to tie you to the system, so that you continue to be a slave to the system. If there are any economists, you can also assist me in terms of saying how can we link the climate and the public debt together. These are all connected and intertwined crises that are coming to the fore and impacting people at different levels and with different implications for different people and different communities and even activists themselves. And as humans, we are facing the most decisive crisis. Our planetary experience, which is here now, contrary to what is sometimes argued, these crises have not arisen from the COVID-19 pandemic. No, I think all of us, we became very much aware that by the time the COVID pandemic came along, the crisis was well overblown. It only exacerbated that kind of crisis. And this is where we are now, to try and look for solutions. And also the exhaustion of natural resources, rising inequalities in a unsustainable global economic system. The COVID-19 only worsened that crisis. And women, and this crisis that we are talking about, it doesn't mean that there were no women who were fighting this. Look at the Wangari Maathais. Women from within the green movements across Africa have been highlighting and responding to these inequalities on both local and global scales for many years. But have they made inroads? Those are some of the questions that we can ask ourselves. From this perspective, green struggles across Africa have a distinctively feminist character. And there's a history of those women who were fighting those. And we can re-look at how Wangari Maathai actually moved along and actually dealt with some of those issues in order to bring about change within the communities that they are working with. In modern society, what is considered productive is seen to be that which earns money and contributes to economic growth. However, this is now the gist of the question that we are trying to create. However, for that productivity to be possible, there is necessary reproductive work that sustains it, including cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, purchasing of growing food, caretaking, emotional support, even to our own human rights defenders, and the work of nurturing community and social networks. This, for the most part, has remained the work of women, and it has remained invisible and undervalued, despite calls for gender equality in the world. That is the conclusion from what she was talking about. All these actions, they've continued to remain undervalued. And we talked about them, and we talk about them usually even to the converted. But we need to respond to this crisis, and we need to strategize in terms of how can we then change with a new natural contract between the human community and other beings of our planet. How can we do that? Stop here and then move on to the next